Planning a cross country move even today is no minor feat. With boxes to be packed, movers to be hired, travel arrangements to be made, relocating is always stressful. But the stresses faced by cross country immigrants 130 years ago, weeks or months of grueling travel, rough or non existent roads, and few amenities, were monumental by modern standards. Homesteaders traveling to Montana in the 1880s had to abandon the majority of all their material possessions, bid farewell to family and friends who they would often never see again, and prepare supplies that would last not only for the long journey ahead, but for the first few months in their new home. As a first step, homesteaders planning to jump off into the West had to choose their mode of transportation. Travel options to Montana in the 1880s were not as limited as we may be tempted to think. Unlike travelers on the Oregon and California trails in the 1840s and 50s, Montana homesteaders had several transportation choices available to them as they headed for the frontier. In 1859, the first steamboat reached Montana after traveling 2,200 miles up the Missouri River from St. Louis. Commercial traffic began the following year. Cabin fare for the trip was around $300, with a rate of 12 cents a pound for freight, prohibitively expensive for families seeking to farm once in their destination. Aside from the cost of steamboat travel, the journey itself was extremely perilous. The Missouri was navigable for only a few short weeks each summer, and the boats frequently ran aground, sank, or burned after their boilers exploded. However, the lure of the frontier was strong, and between 1860 and 1888, more than 40,000 passengers made the treacherous trip. The steamboat trade, with its expense and limitations, dropped off sharply in the mid 1880s as the first railroads reached Montana and opened up to passenger service. Emigrant cars, specially designed for the prospective settler, offered dismal and cramped accommodations to those with enough money to pay for the cost of trip. Passengers in emigrant cars were often forced to spend their journeys sitting upright in uncushioned, backless benches. On many trains, the management offered thin straw mattresses at a cost of $3 each, which would be laid on the floor beneath the benches. One settler remembered, "My mother had a real hard time getting any sleep on the train. Anytime she lay down under the benches, her feet stuck out into the aisle, and the conductor would come along and kick her." Privacy in the cars was minimal, with no dividing partitions and a common toilet and cook stove for as many as 30 immigrants. Wealthier settlers could rent out entire boxcars in which to transport not only their family members, but also their household goods, farming equipment, and up to 6 heads of cattle. The most common means of transport of families into Montana and elsewhere was by far the covered wagon. In lieu of the huge and bulky Conestoga wagons used in the late 18th and early 19th centuries to transport freight, emigrants west of the Mississippi opted for the lighter and more easily managed prairie schooner, a converted farm wagon so named because it looked like a boat crossing the sea of grasses that made up the Great Plains. The typical prairie schooner weighed about 1 ton, was 14 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. Built of seasoned wood such as maple, hickory, or oak, schooners' only metal fitting were their iron tire rims and reinforcements on their wooden axles. Most schooners had double floors that concealed 2-foot deep storage compartments. The wagon box itself was caulked or covered with hides to make it watertight, which was particularly crucial when crossing unbridged rivers and streams. The canvas top, or bonnet, of the wagon was a tawny double-ply homespun cotton that was treated with linseed oil or tallow to make it waterproof. Often, settlers sewed pockets into the bonnet to maximize their storage space. The bonnet was supported by hardwood bows that were soaked in water until they became pliable enough to bend into a U shape. Openings at the front and back of the bonnet provided ventilation. Homesteaders had to pack essentials for life on and off the trail into this confined space. Although game could be shot and roots and berries could be gathered while in transit, settlers carried the vast majority of their food in the wagon, taking up most of their storage space. Basic staples included flour, bacon, sugar, coffee, tea, dried fruit, cornmeal, and rice. Some resourceful immigrants brought along eggs, packed in barrels of flour or meal. Settlers packed minimum utensils for cooking, often limiting themselves to a skillet, a coffee pot, tin plates and cups, a camp stove, and a few sets of flatware. Packing and preparing for a new life. Crucial to any overland journey were rifles, pistols, powder, and lead, used both for hunting and for self-defense. Typical homesteaders would pack 2 or 3 changes of durable warm clothing, as well as blankets and rubber mats for camping. Many settlers attempted to load books, furniture, and other treasure belongings into their wagons, but these were often left behind after a short time on the road when draft animals became tired and when draft animals became tired and the load needed to be lightened. Because of the roughness of the trail and the length of the journey, spare wagon parts such as spokes, axles, and wheels were often slung under the wagon, while water buckets and water barrels were strapped to its sides. Some immigrants attempted to bring along milk cows and chickens, though the chickens were usually eaten, and the cows often died of thirst or malnutrition along the way. Joseph Gage Bartlett, who moved to Montana from Kansas in 1876, remembered, "We had 2 8-yoke ox teams drawing 2 wagons each. Some of the other families in the wagon train had horse teams and thought we were too slow. We brought along some calves tethered to the back of the wagon, but they became footsore and we had to put them in a wagon. We also had chickens in that wagon. When we stopped for the night, we would let them run around." Planning for any extended overland migration was an enormous financial drain on homesteaders. The wagon and oxen cost about $400 and supplies about $1,000. Additionally, settlers needed several $100s of cash on hand for the trip to pay for supplies that had been used up, ferry tolls, replacement oxen or wagon parts, and food for the first winter on the frontier. Many families had to save for months or years to afford the trip and had to sell off their lands, household goods and furnishings, and heirlooms to finance their journeys. After property had been liquidated, supplies bought, and goodbyes said, homesteaders could hit the trail carrying about 2,500 pounds of freight in their ox-drawn prairie schooners. Because the wagons were so full and because they traveled at the not quite dizzying speed of 2 miles per hour, many settlers, men, women, and children, walked beside their wagons across the continent. When Minnesota settler Pamelia Dillon Fergus received a letter from her husband, James, summoning her to rejoin him and bring their 4 children for a new life in Montana Territory, her husband, keenly aware of the life they would face on the trail and in their new home, provided explicit directions to his wife on how to prepare for the journey. He instructed her to sell all she could at private auction and bring no poor articles west with her. He advised her to have the sides of the wagon boarded up high with thin boards to keep things from falling out and cautioned her to never let one of the children go out or in the wagon without stopping it, as many get killed or injured by the wagon running over them. Remarkably, James Fergus also sent his wife a complete list of items that she would need to bring in the family's 3 wagons, ranging from 600 pounds of flour to $5 worth of stamps to whiskey for poisoned cattle. For a complete list with Fergus's spelling preserved, here is our list. Let's see. 3 good covered wagons, 9 yokes of good cattle, 1 cow, 1 tent. 600 pounds of flour, 300 pounds of meat, 50 beans, 100 pounds of rice, 2 crackers, 300 bacon, 200 ham, 50 dry beef, 50 cheese, 50 butter, 400 sugar, 200 gallons of syrup, 50 pounds of black tea, 100 pounds of coffee, 400 pounds of dried apples, 100 pounds of dried peaches, 220 salt, 40 desiccated vegetarian raisins. For clothing, 1 suit of good clothes for him, including hat and boots, 1 everyday coat, 2 pairs of everyday pants, 2 good pairs of shoes, 1 good pair of boots, 1 good pair of undershirts, 1 pair of good woolen undershirt, 2 pairs of good drawers, 2 pairs of woolen mittens, 12 pairs of good everyday shoes for Pamela and her daughters, 1 pair of good boots for each, 2 pair of boots for Andrew, their son, shoes for Lily, the little one, stockings for Andrew, the other kids, woolen shirts, dresses, sewing machine needles, pepper, spices, vinegar, codfish, bedding, cooking apparatuses, washing apparatuses, bunch of miscellaneous stuff, whole bunch of stationery to write on, all of his tools, etc.